All right, welcome back to the deep dive. I'm always wondering about this. Like, if you're studying with other people, does it actually help you get better at using what you learned when you come across a new situation?
It's a great question. It's all about transfer,
Yeah,
right? Being
got
able
it.
to actually apply your knowledge.
Exactly. And today, we're going to dive deep into that idea of transfer, that ability to really take what you know and apply it in a flexible way, not just in the same old context.
And for this deep dive, we're looking at a meta-analysis, which basically means they've taken 24 different studies about small group learning and its effect on transfer, and combined all the findings together. So it's like getting a super comprehensive view of the research.
Yeah, meta-analyses are great for that. They give you a bigger picture. I think most people are familiar with the idea of small group learning being recommended.
Yeah,
Whether you're in school or doing professional development, people are always saying, oh, work together, work together. And we know it helps with learning the material in the first place. But what's always been less clear is whether it actually helps you take that knowledge and then use it in a different situation, maybe one you didn't specifically prepare for. That's where transfer comes in.
yeah.
And Bransford and his colleagues, they define it as being able to adapt what you know to new circumstances.
Which is the whole point of learning, right? I mean, it's not
Yeah.
just about remembering facts. It's about understanding them well enough to actually use them effectively in different situations. So that's what we're going to explore today. Does learning in small groups actually help you become more adaptable with your knowledge? And if it does, how does that actually work?
All right, so let's get right to it. Does learning in small groups give you an advantage when it comes to using your knowledge in new ways? What did this meta-analysis find?
Well, the simple answer is yes. It does seem to have a positive effect.
Okay, so there is a benefit. How big of a benefit are we talking about
Yeah,
here?
so they calculated something called an average effect size, and it came out to 0.30.
Okay. And for anyone who's not familiar with effect sizes, what does that number actually mean?
Basically, it means that, on average, across all those studies, the people who learned in small groups performed better on tasks that tested their ability to transfer knowledge compared to those who learned individually. And that difference was statistically significant, meaning it wasn't just due to random chance.
That's interesting. And you know what? That actually aligns with other research that's been done in the past, even going back to the 80s. There were studies by Johnson and his colleagues that showed that generally, small group learning led to better academic outcomes compared to, say, learning individually or in a competitive environment. So there really does seem to be something powerful about that collaboration aspect.
Yeah, definitely. But here's where it gets really interesting. When we talk about small group learning, there are different ways to do it. You could have structured learning,
Structured learning. Okay.
which means, you have things like assigned roles within the group, maybe even scripts to guide how you interact with each other, or group rewards, or a strong emphasis on individual accountability. And then on the flip side, you have unstructured learning,
Okay. Unstructured.
where it's basically, hey, you guys are a group, go learn together. No real explicit guidelines.
So one is like having a very detailed blueprint, and the other one is more free-flowing. Now, if you were to think about which one would be better for something as complex as knowledge transfer, you probably assume that having more structure would be the key, right?
And that makes sense. I mean, a lot of the research on learning in general does suggest that having more structure in group activities can be really beneficial. But what's interesting is that this meta-analysis, specifically looking at transfer, found something that was kind of unexpected. They didn't find a significant difference between how much structured versus unstructured groups helps with transfer.
Wow, really? So having all those bells and whistles, the roles, the scripts, the rewards, maybe it's not as crucial as we might think when it comes to being able to apply knowledge in new situations.
Yeah, that's a big takeaway. However, there was also something they found. There was a lot of variation in the results across the studies they analyzed. So it suggests that while small group learning generally does help with transfer, there are probably other factors at play that determine just how much of a difference it makes.
Interesting. Okay, so we know small groups can be beneficial for transfer. Let's dig a little deeper into the why. What are the actual reasons why collaborating with others might make you more adaptable with your knowledge?
So there are a few key mechanisms at play here, and they're all kind of interconnected. One important aspect is that working in a group can actually lead to a deeper understanding of the material.
Deeper understanding. Okay.
Yeah. Because when you're interacting with others, you're explaining your perspective, you're listening to their viewpoints, you're negotiating, you're trying to reach a shared understanding.
Yeah.
And this process helps you go beyond just surface level comprehension. You have to really grapple with the concepts.
Yeah, it forces you to engage more actively, right?
Right. And one researcher, Schwartz, even suggested that groups might actually come up with more general and less specific ways of thinking about the information in order to kind of bridge those individual perspectives.
That's fascinating. It reminds me of that saying, if you want to truly learn something, try teaching it.
Exactly. And that actually leads to another mechanism, which is the act of giving and receiving explanations.
Okay, so explaining things to each other.
Yeah. Researchers like Chi and Roscoe have shown that when you put your thoughts into words, it actually helps you organize them more effectively in your own mind.
It's like you're creating a mental map,
Oh.
right? By verbalizing it.
Yeah, exactly. And then when your peers give you feedback or they ask you clarifying questions, it can help you identify any gaps in your own understanding.
Yeah, those aha moments.
Exactly. Okita and Schwartz, they talk about this back and forth feedback within a group, this recursive feedback, which can be really powerful for learning.
So it's not just about the amount of information, it's the quality of the cognitive work that happens when you're actually interacting with others.
Yeah, that back and forth is so crucial. And another key benefit of small groups is that they promote what we call abstraction and differentiation.
Abstraction and differentiation, okay.
So when you're exposed to different perspectives and different examples within a group, it encourages you to look for the underlying principles, the core ideas, instead of just focusing on the specific details of one situation.
It's like seeing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, exactly. If you only ever see like one type of car, it's hard to really understand the general concept of a vehicle. But when you see a car and then a truck and then a motorcycle, you start to understand the essential features that make something a vehicle.
So those different examples help you abstract to see the bigger picture.
Yeah. And researchers like Bransford and Schwartz, they've talked a lot about how this process of comparing and contrasting helps make your knowledge less tied to a specific context and therefore more transferable.
Okay, that makes sense. And then the last mechanism you mentioned was metacognitive thinking. Can you remind us what that is again?
Yeah, metacognitive thinking is basically your awareness of your own thinking process.
Okay.
And in a group setting, you're more likely to observe how other people approach a problem, what strategies they use, how they monitor their own understanding.
You're getting insights into other people's thinking.
Exactly. And then you might start to adopt those strategies yourself without even realizing it. It's like you're getting this informal training in how to be a better learner just by working with others.
That's fascinating. It's like learning by osmosis almost.
Yeah, exactly. And we even have a really compelling example from a study by Kirschner and his colleagues. They had students learning about heredity, and they divided them into groups where each person only had part of the information. And these groups actually outperformed individuals who had all the information from the start on transfer tasks.
Really? So having less information initially actually led to better transfer.
Yeah. And the researchers suggested that it was because by sharing the cognitive load, each person could focus on their piece of the puzzle and process it more deeply. And that deeper processing led to better transfer.
That's amazing. Okay, so we've talked about how small groups can facilitate transfer, but I want to circle back to that finding about structured versus unstructured groups.
Right.
The fact that there wasn't a significant difference, why do you think that might be?
Well, one possibility is that the way structure was defined in this meta-analysis was really broad.
Okay, broad definition of structure.
Yeah, it might have included a wider range of approaches than what we typically consider highly structured cooperative learning. And cooperative learning often has this element of positive interdependence.
Positive interdependence. Now, for those who haven't heard that term before, can you explain what that means?
Sure. Positive interdependence basically means that everyone's success is tied together. You can only achieve your own goals if the group achieves its goals. It's that we're all in this together feeling.
So maybe some of those structured groups in the meta-analysis didn't have that strong sense of interdependence, and that's why the structure didn't have as much of an impact.
Yeah, that's possible. Another thing to consider is the context of the studies. Things like task complexity, group size, even the age of the learners could all influence whether having a lot of structure makes a big difference for transfer. For instance, structure might be more important in larger groups to prevent what's called social loafing, where some people don't contribute as much.
Right, because you need more coordination in a larger group.
Exactly. And for really difficult tasks, structure might help manage the cognitive load. However, it's worth noting that most of the studies in this meta-analysis had pretty small groups, like 2 or 3 people. So maybe with such small groups, the natural back and forth is enough to provide structure, even without formal guidelines.
Right, because with just a couple of people, it's easier to stay on track and make sure everyone's contributing.
Yeah, exactly. And one more thing the researchers pointed out is that many of the structured groups in these studies didn't have that strong positive interdependence that we talked about. For example, a group might have a shared goal, but individual members weren't necessarily held accountable for reaching that goal.
Right, so there's a disconnect between the individual effort and the group outcome.
Yeah, and that could definitely weaken the impact of structure on transfer.
Okay, so it seems like the type of structure, and especially whether it fosters that sense of interdependence, might be more important than just having some kind of structure in place.
That's a really good point.
Which brings us to the fact that unstructured groups still showed a positive effect on transfer. What does that tell us?
Well, it suggests that there's something inherently beneficial about the process of collaborating itself when it comes to applying knowledge in new ways.
Inherent benefits of collaboration. Okay.
Yeah. Even without specific rules or roles, just discussing ideas, explaining your reasoning, being exposed to different viewpoints, it seems to naturally support the kind of thinking that's important for transfer.
So there's power in that informal exchange of ideas.
Definitely. And the researchers made another really important point. They said, if you're studying learning, you have to measure transfer.
Okay, measuring transfer is crucial.
Yeah, because in some of the studies they looked at, there were no significant differences between group and individual learning when they just measured retention, like remembering the facts. But when they looked at how well students could use that knowledge in new situations, that's when the benefits of group work became clear.
So the true test of whether a learning method is effective is whether it helps you apply what you've learned, not just remember it.
Exactly. And while this meta-analysis gives us a lot of good insights, there are still some open questions, some areas where more research is needed.
What are some of those areas that you think future research should focus on?
Well, one thing is that this meta-analysis didn't have a lot of studies with younger students or larger groups. So it's possible that for those populations, more explicit structure might be more important for successful collaboration and transfer.
Yeah, because different age groups and group dynamics might require different approaches.
Right. And as we discussed, the way structure was defined and implemented varied quite a bit across the studies. So future research could really dig into the impact of different types of structure, like comparing group rewards versus roles versus scripts, and how those specifically affect transfer.
Right, breaking down the different components of structure.
Exactly. It would also be really valuable to investigate how factors like task complexity and group size interact with structure to influence transfer. For example, is a highly structured approach more helpful for a really complex task with a large team?
Yeah, those are all great questions. And what about the actual interactions within the groups? Is there something specific that happens in unstructured groups that really helps with the transfer?
That's another key area for future research. By comparing how structured and unstructured groups interact while working on the same task, we might be able to identify the mechanisms that are most strongly linked to promoting transfer.
So observing the process of collaboration itself to see what's really working.
Exactly. And there's also a need to understand the relationship between how we measure transfer and other concepts like conceptual understanding in collaborative settings. Are we really capturing distinct things with these measures?
Yeah, because sometimes those lines can be blurry. More research could help clarify those distinctions.
And finally, we need more studies that specifically design their group activities to include strong positive interdependence and then directly measure transfer. That would really help us solidify our understanding in this area.
Absolutely. So to wrap things up, what's the main takeaway for our listeners from this deep dive into small group learning and transfer?
The key message is that learning in small groups seems to be a really valuable way to boost your ability to apply your knowledge in new situations. And while the optimal level and type of structure are still being researched, the evidence suggests that simply working together in a group, even without a lot of formal structure, can have a positive effect on transfer.
So the collaborative process itself has inherent value. Okay, so here's a final thought for our listeners to consider. Given that even unstructured collaboration seems to benefit transfer, what are some ways you can intentionally incorporate more collaborative learning into your own life, whether it's at work or in your personal learning? This could be as simple as discussing ideas with a colleague, working through a problem with a friend, or seeking out diverse perspectives on a topic you're trying to learn. It seems like tapping into the power of shared thinking might be a more effective way to really understand and apply what you learn than you might have realized. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
My pleasure.